Trying to keep up with all the latest tech and figure out how it's going to change business? Well, let's just say it can be a bit overwhelming, like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, absolutely. Information overload is a real problem these days.
It is. That's kind of the whole reason we do this deep dive thing.
Right, to cut through all the noise and get to the stuff that really matters.
Exactly. So today we're diving deep into the strategic management of technology. We found this amazing book, and it really lays out a framework for understanding how tech shifts impact businesses, any business, really.
And when we say framework, we mean it. This book gets into a lot of detail. We're going to be talking about what technology actually is at its core, like how do we even define it? And then we're going to explore how new tech kind of muscles its way into the market.
Yeah, like why do some companies totally nail it when it comes to tech changes while others just completely faceplant?
Right. It's a real mix. We'll be digging into all sorts of things, from how to define technology to why having the right people with the right skills in your company is like mission critical.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Where do we even begin with something as big as technology?
Well, the book starts by giving a really solid definition of technology. And I think it's helpful because it moves us beyond just thinking about science or specific techniques.
Okay, so what's the definition?
It says technology is the combination of practical know-how, like that hands-on experience, with scientific knowledge.
Right, so it's not enough to just have the science. You need to know how to actually use it.
Exactly. And the goal of this whole combo is to create products or services that meet real, tangible needs, like the social and economic needs of people and businesses.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not just some cool invention in a lab. It's about actually solving real problems for real people.
Right. And that brings us to another really important point the book makes: the difference between invention and innovation.
Yeah, invention versus innovation. I feel like those words get thrown around a lot.
They do.
Mm.
But there's a distinct difference. Think of an invention as like the initial spark. It's a new idea, a new concept, maybe even a blueprint for doing something in a totally new way. Like getting a patent is a sign that you've got an invention.
Okay, so the invention is like the initial aha moment.
Exactly. But innovation, that's where you take that initial spark and you make it real.
Yeah.
You make it feasible, like you figure out how to actually make it work in the real world. And most importantly, you get people to use it.
So an invention could just stay stuck in a lab somewhere, but an innovation actually gets out there and changes things.
Right. An invention without innovation is just a cool idea.
Okay, so we've got the basics of what technology is and the difference between invention and innovation. Now let's talk about how technologies change and, sometimes, totally replace what came before them. The book uses this really interesting analogy about tools for calculation.
Right. It looks at how we've calculated things over time, and it's fascinating to see the progression.
Yeah, take us through that progression.
Okay, so way back when, you had the abacus, then came the slide rule, which was like a huge step forward, and then came the electronic calculator, which was even more of a game changer. Then, of course, you have the personal computer, and now we have smartphones, which can basically do it all.
And each one of those was, in its own time, like the absolute best way to do calculations.
Exactly. And it really illustrates this concept of technological evolution, how things change and improve over time.
And the book introduces this S-curve model to help visualize that, right?
It does. The S-curve model is a way to show how a technology might spread. You have this initial slow period where not many people are using it, then it takes off and grows super fast, and then it eventually levels off as the tech matures.
Okay, that makes sense. So the S-curve is a helpful way to get a general idea of how a technology might develop.
Yeah, it's a good starting point. But, and this is important, the book also points out that the S-curve model is a simplification. The real world of tech is a lot messier than a simple curve.
Right. In reality, things don't always follow such a neat and predictable path.
Exactly. You might have a really dominant tech that's been around forever and everyone uses it. And then suddenly a totally new technology pops up and disrupts everything.
Yeah, it can happen really fast too, which the S-curve doesn't always capture.
Totally. And the book emphasizes that there's just so much innovation happening all the time. They call it a mushrooming reality, where there are tons of new ideas and potential technologies popping up all the time.
But only a small fraction of those actually become successful.
Right. Most of them either fail or they just never find a market.
So the S-curve gives us a basic idea, but the real story of how technologies replace each other is a lot more complex. And that leads us to the different patterns of substitution that the book talks about.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting and where understanding these patterns can give you a real edge.
Okay, so tell us about these patterns.
So the book identifies 10 different patterns that go beyond that basic S-curve. Each pattern has its own unique characteristics and implications for how technologies evolve.
Okay, so let's walk through a few of these patterns. What's the first one?
The first one is called the base case, and it's actually the closest to that idealized S-curve we were talking about.
So pretty straightforward.
Yeah. In the base case, a new technology comes along and completely replaces the old one. The example they give is the transition from the Bessemer process to the open hearth process in steelmaking. It was a pretty clean switch.
Okay, that makes sense. Then there's the partial base case, right?
Yes. The partial base case is where the new technology becomes the dominant one, but the old technology doesn't completely disappear.
So it hangs on in certain areas.
Exactly. It might find its niche in certain parts of the market or for specific applications. A good example is circuit breakers and fuses in electrical systems. Circuit breakers are the standard now, but fuses are still used in some situations.
Okay, I can see that. So new tech mostly takes over, but the old tech still has its place. What about the burst pattern?
Oh, the burst pattern. This is when you have a new technology that everyone is super hyped about. People think it's going to revolutionize everything.
So lots of buzz.
Tons of buzz.
Hmm.
But then, for whatever reason, the revolution doesn't happen. The technology just never really gains traction.
It's like a big firework that fizzles out.
Yeah, exactly. It could be that the tech isn't ready, or maybe the market just isn't there yet. But the result is that the adoption is really limited.
All hype, no substance. Okay, what about the Pathfinder pattern?
Ah, the Pathfinder. This is a really interesting one. The Pathfinder starts slowly, often in a very specific niche market. It might just appeal to a small group of early adopters.
So it's under the radar for a while.
Totally. But then something changes. Maybe a related technology develops that makes the Pathfinder more viable, or maybe the market conditions shift in its favor. And all of a sudden, the Pathfinder explodes in popularity.
Wow, so it's like a slow burn that suddenly catches fire.
Yeah, great analogy. A good example is the optical video disc. It started as Laserdisc, which was pretty niche, but then it evolved into the DVD and totally took over the market.
Okay, that's a really good illustration. Now, what about this double shift?
A double shift happens when you have 3 generations of technology. The second generation is starting to take over from the first, but then a third generation comes along and disrupts everything.
So the second generation never even gets a chance to fully mature.
Right. The third generation jumps ahead and becomes the dominant technology. The book gives the example of the typesetting industry. They went from analog to CRT-based systems, but then jumped right to laser technology before CRT could really dominate.
That's a pretty wild scenario to think about. Okay, and then there's reverting, which sounds kind of counterintuitive.
It is. In the reverting pattern, you have a technology that loses ground to a newer technology. But then something happens that causes the older technology to make a comeback.
Like a blast from the past.
Exactly. It could be that the newer tech has some unexpected downsides, or that new regulations favor the older technology. The example they give is organochlorine pesticides, like DDT, which declined, but then saw a resurgence as people became more aware of the problems with the alternatives.
Wow, that's a lot of different ways that technology can rise and fall. And the book also talks about last gasp and intermediate hybrid as strategies that companies can use to try and defend themselves against new technologies, right?
They do. The last gasp is when a company with an established technology tries to make a final push to improve it and hold off the competition.
Like a desperate attempt to stay relevant.
Pretty much. And then the intermediate hybrid is where a company tries to combine elements of the old technology and the new technology to create something that's sort of in between.
So trying to find a middle ground.
Exactly. It's like a way to hedge their bets and see what sticks.
Okay, understanding these patterns seems really important if you want to make good strategic decisions when new technologies come along. Now, what are some of the key factors that influence which of these patterns actually plays out in the real world?
Well, one of the most important things to understand is Moore's crossing the chasm concept. It talks about the different types of customers who adopt new technologies.
Yeah.
You have the innovators, who are the first ones to try anything new, and then you have the early adopters, who are more visionary and see the potential for the new technology.
Right, so the early adopters are the ones who are willing to take a risk on something new.
Exactly. But then you have the early majority, and these are the people you need to convince if you want a technology to really take off.
So that's where the chasm comes in, right?
Yes. The chasm is that gap between the early adopters and the early majority.
Yeah.
And it can be a really tough gap to cross.
Why is that? Why is it so hard to convince the early majority?
Because the early majority are a lot more cautious than the early adopters. They want to see proof that a technology actually works and that it's going to be beneficial for them.
They're not as willing to just jump in and experiment.
Right. They want to see other people using the technology successfully before they're willing to try it. They want to see what the book calls referencing.
So they need that social proof.
Exactly.
Mm.
And the book points out that this can create a real challenge for new technologies. They need to find a way to appeal to the early majority and convince them that it's worth the risk.
Okay, so that's crossing the chasm. What about this idea of an increasing rate of adoption? How does that fit into all of this?
Well, the increasing rate of adoption is often driven by what we call network effects.
Remind me what network effects are again?
Network effects mean that a technology becomes more valuable as more people use it. Like, think about social media. If only a few people are using it, it's not that useful. But as more people join, it becomes more valuable to everyone.
Right, because there are more people to connect with.
Exactly. And that can create this snowball effect where the more people use a technology, the faster it grows.
So network effects can help a technology cross the chasm.
They definitely can. Once a technology has enough users, it can become very attractive to the early majority.
Okay, so getting that initial momentum is key.
It is. But before technology has crossed the chasm, the lack of users can actually work against it. It's like a chicken and egg problem.
Interesting. So network effects can be both a blessing and a curse.
Absolutely. And the book uses a really clever analogy to explain how this increasing rate of adoption can play out. They talk about a bowling alley with different colored balls. As one ball knocks down pins, it sets off a chain reaction that knocks down more pins, and so on.
So once you get that initial momentum, it can create a cascade of adoption.
Exactly. And that can lead to one technology really dominating a market.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about technological lock-in?
Technological lock-in is a really powerful force that can prevent new technologies from taking over.
Even if the new technology is better.
Even then, it happens when an existing technology is so entrenched, because of the infrastructure that supports it, people's habits, and the other products and services that are built around it, that it becomes almost impossible to switch.
So the cost of switching is just too high.
Right. And the book gives the example of the QWERTY keyboard layout. It's not the most efficient design, but we're all so used to it that it would be incredibly disruptive to switch to something different.
It would take a huge effort to change something like that.
Totally. And the book also talks about this threshold for triggering substitution.
What does that mean?
It means that for a new technology to really take off, it needs to offer a significant advantage over the existing technology. It needs to be so much better that it's worth the cost and hassle of switching.
So a small improvement isn't enough to overcome the inertia of lock-in.
Right. The benefits of the new technology have to be really clear and compelling.
Okay, I'm seeing how these concepts really interplay. What about this concept of dematuration?
Denaturation is a fascinating concept. It happens when an industry is disrupted by a major external shock.
So something that comes out of left field and shakes things up.
Exactly. It could be a big change in government regulations, a sudden environmental crisis, or even something like a pandemic.
So basically anything that throws the industry into chaos.
Pretty much. And when that happens, it can create opportunities for radical innovation. Because suddenly, the old rules don't apply anymore.
It's like the playing field gets leveled.
Right. And that can open the door for new technologies that might not have had a chance before.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different dynamics of technological change. Now, how do companies actually approach all of this strategically?
Well, the book introduces these two really helpful frameworks: the dual technology tree, or DTT, and the customer concept tree, or CCT.
Okay, tell me more about those. What are they?
So the DTT is basically a visual map of all the different technologies that could be used to fulfill a particular need or function.
So it's like a branching tree of possibilities.
Exactly. And it includes not just existing technologies, but also potential future technologies.
So it helps you think about all the different options that are out there.
Right. And then the CCT focuses on the customer side of things.
Okay, how does that work?
The CCT maps out all the different needs and preferences of customers. So things like what features they want, how much they're willing to pay, and so on.
So it's a way to understand different market segments.
Exactly. And the real power comes from thinking about how the DTT and the CCT interact.
So you're looking for those sweet spots where a particular technology aligns with a particular set of customer needs.
You got it. And that's where you can find the most promising opportunities for innovation.
Makes sense. So it's all about strategically matching up technologies and customer needs.
Right. And the book also emphasizes the importance of competence when it comes to navigating these technological transitions.
And what does competence mean in this context?
Competence refers to all the knowledge, skills, and abilities that a company needs to develop, deploy, and use technologies effectively.
So it's about having the right people with the right expertise.
Exactly. And the book introduces this concept called transilience, which is a measure of how much an innovation changes the competencies that a company needs.
So a high transilience innovation would require a company to develop totally new skills and knowledge.
Exactly. It would be a major shift for them. A low transilience innovation, on the other hand, might not require as much change.
Okay, that's a helpful distinction. And this is where we see the Kodak story play out again, right?
Absolutely. Kodak failed to build the competencies they needed for the digital world, and it ultimately cost them dearly.
They didn't adapt to the changing technological landscape.
Right. Even if they weren't sure if digital photography would take off, they could have at least started developing some basic competencies in those areas.
So it's like buying insurance.
Exactly. The book calls it buying insurance through competence. It's about preparing for different possible futures, even if you're not sure which one will actually happen.
Makes sense. So you're not just trying to predict the future, but you're hedging your bets by developing a wider range of competencies.
Right. And the book talks about different degrees of competence development, ranging from reinforcing existing competencies to building entirely new ones.
So there's a spectrum of approaches.
There is. And then they present this two-dimensional model for strategic behavior during technological change.
Tell me about that model.
It looks at two things: a company's influence over the direction of technological change, and how well their existing competencies align with the new requirements.
Okay, so it's about how much control you have and how prepared you are.
Exactly. And based on those two factors, the model suggests different strategic options.
Like what?
Well, if you have a lot of influence and your competencies are a good fit, you can try to promote the new technology. If you have less influence but your competencies are still a good fit, you might want to just monitor the situation closely. If you have a lot of influence but your competencies aren't a good fit, you might try to defend the existing technology or shape the new technology in a way that benefits you. And if you have low influence and a poor fit, you're going to have to adapt quickly or risk being left behind.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. Okay, so all of this points to the importance of having someone at the top level of a company who's thinking strategically about technology. And that brings us to the role of the Chief Technology Officer, or CTO.
Absolutely. The CTO plays a crucial role in guiding a company's technology strategy.
So what are some of the key things a CTO should be doing?
Well, they need to constantly be monitoring the technological landscape to see what's emerging. They need to conduct regular technology reviews to assess the company's capabilities. And they need to systematically look for opportunities to improve existing technologies, adopt new technologies, and even diversify into new areas.
And that insurance principle we talked about earlier, developing competencies for the future, that's part of the CTO's job too, right?
Absolutely. The CTO should be thinking about what skills and knowledge the company might need in the future and making sure they're developing them.
It's about being proactive and preparing for different possibilities.
Exactly. And the book also talks about the different strategic options that companies have when they see a disruptive technology on the horizon.
So what are some of those options?
Well, they can try to incrementally improve their existing technology to make it more competitive. They can try to hybridize their existing technology with the new technology. They can invest in internal development of the new technology. They can acquire a company that already has expertise in the new technology. They can form partnerships to gain access to the new technology. Or, in some cases, they might even decide to exit the market altogether.
Wow, that's a lot of different options to consider.
It is. And the right choice will depend on a lot of factors, like the company's resources, their risk tolerance, and their overall strategic goals. The German car industry exploring e-fuels is a great example of that hybridization strategy, trying to find a way to make their existing combustion engine technology work in a future with stricter emission regulations.
It shows that companies need to be adaptable and creative.
Definitely. And the example of Novo's insulin strategy shows how risky it can be to try to predict the future of technology. They made a big bet on pro-insulin, but it didn't pay off because the market shifted in a different direction.
So even the best laid plans can go awry.
They can. And that's why it's so important to be flexible and to have a diverse set of competencies.
Okay, so as we look ahead to this industry of the future, which sounds like it's going to be driven by AI, the Internet of Things, and all sorts of other advanced technologies, what are the key takeaways from all of this? What should companies be thinking about?
Well, the book emphasizes that this transformation, this fourth industrial revolution, as some call it, isn't just about adopting new technologies. It's about what they call managerial orchestration. It's about developing new strategies, allocating resources effectively, and making changes to organizational structures and cultures.
So it's a much bigger change than just buying the latest gadgets.
It is. It's about fundamentally changing how you do business. And the book gives an example of a company called Corp Z that was experimenting with remote monitoring of its plants.
Hmm.
They found that it wasn't enough to just have the technology. They also needed to build a culture of collaboration and trust among their remote teams.
So the softer skills become really important in this new environment.
Absolutely. Things like communication, collaboration, and trust building are crucial.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive into the strategic management of technology? What do we want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that technological change is complex. It's not always predictable, and it can happen very quickly.
Yeah, that S-curve model is a good starting point, but it's definitely not the whole story.
Right. And we've seen how there are all these different patterns of technological substitution that can play out.
And companies need to be aware of those patterns and the factors that influence them. Things like network effects, technological lock-in, and dematuration.
Absolutely. And perhaps most importantly, companies need to be proactive about building the right competencies. They need to have the knowledge, skills, and adaptability to thrive in a constantly changing technological landscape.
So it's not just about choosing the right technologies, it's about building the right capabilities within your organization.
Exactly. And this deep dive has given you, the listener, a framework for thinking about these issues more strategically. It's about looking beyond the hype and really understanding the dynamics at play.
So as you're thinking about your own industry or your own area of interest, what potential disruptions might be on the horizon? What seemingly small changes could have a huge impact down the line? And most importantly, what competencies do you need to be developing today to prepare for those changes?
Those are the questions we want you to be thinking about.
That's some food for thought as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.